All right. So, yes, Fernanda, welcome back on this lovely afternoon. I think you'll be pleased to hear that I don't think we're going to be taking up the whole time that's been allotted for this. Some of the content you've really covered this morning, and whilst overlearning is a sound pedagogical practice, I think doing the same thing twice in such a short space of time probably leads to boredom rather than better learning. So I'm going to try and avoid that. We're going to be looking at challenging stakeholders to implement change. So your role possibly as an Elenco, and of course there may be some of you in the room who aren't yet Elencos, or maybe you don't ever want to be an Elenco, but you are clearly all here because you are interested in better inclusive education, making sure that all learners are getting as good an experience as possible. And so that might well mean that we have to challenge those around us sometimes. And that links in, I think, a little bit to one of those final questions to Lynn this morning, about how can Eston be appear to be a little bit more friendly and supportive, from that, which I thought she gave some good answers to. But there is, of course, a need sometimes, isn't there, to challenge, first of all, ourselves. I think that's really important, because unless we're willing to challenge ourselves, what right have we got to challenge others? And sometimes that kind of challenge can be an uncomfortable experience. And I suppose, still kind of riffing on that Estin question, perhaps for those of you who are Elencos or soon will be Elencos, perhaps one of the things that we need to be thinking of is, how do we prepare those with whom we are working for Estin visits and other such experiences that are similar? So how can we prepare ourselves and the colleagues that we work with to be able to engage with and cope with challenges that might be robust sometimes? And I suppose one of the best ways to do that is to kind of put into practice those sorts of things in our own settings with people that we know, we are relatively comfortable with. But the more we can prepare ourselves and those around us to meet those, to be willing to and able to answer robust challenges and questions. Why are you doing it in this way? What's happening to this particular learner? How you engage them with this particular curriculum topic, etc., etc. Then that means that shows that we're really doing our job if we're creating staff in particular, all sorts of staff, not just teachers, but teaching support as well, and admin in the school. We're creating those skills within them that can respond to some of these challenges. Then we're really doing our job. Okay. So reflecting on skills needed to engage and challenge key stakeholders and to implement change. And there'll be a little bit about policy, which you all probably know back to front anyway, and a little bit about some theoretical perspectives and frameworks, which might help us consider some of these things. So we're thinking about identifying key processes that support change for inclusion and evaluating these in relation to professional practice, critically reflecting upon effective practices to support professional learning and the implementation of change. I think that I like that aim, reflecting upon effective practices. It can be very easy to highlight, because they're easy to spot, practices which perhaps aren't effective or don't work particularly well, or things that we know we need to do better. But sometimes a great starting point can be thinking about those things that are done well, or that we have seen elsewhere going well. And that's that kind of solutions focus perspective. It's very easy, isn't it, in a staff room after a difficult morning, to think about, to ponder on those things that haven't gone well that particular morning, or those difficult conversations you've had with parents at the gate, etc., etc. But sometimes that solutions focus can be really useful for us to try and nurture and cultivate within our settings. And then to consider how the professional standards for teaching and leadership support change for inclusion, which you've done some of this morning. So we won't go into that in so much detail. All right, theories of change relevant to inclusive education. Well, first of all, just the policy background, which again, you're all very familiar with, I'm sure, but always worth reminding ourselves, I guess, of that context, excuse me, that context that we're operating in. So the ALN has a pivotal role under the new arrangements and carries out a range of roles. I'm sure you all know that, you've all experienced that, including translating ALN principles and supporting classroom practice, but also auditing and reporting roles. And so this is supported by various policy, including the Additional Learning Needs and Education Tribunal Act 2018. So this act officially transitioned the role from the historical non-statutory special education needs coordinator to the statutory role of the ALN. And this legal shift deliberately elevated the position to a strategic school-wide leadership level within education settings in Wales. So it's that very strategic role. And of course, that can be very difficult to take that step back and think strategically when you're having to deal with everyday problems or challenges that are being presented to you as you walk down the corridor. So it's really important to think about how you can make time to have that strategic space to think and to plan. And if that's something that you're really struggling with, then perhaps you need to discuss that with your senior leadership team to see how you might carve some of that out. Because I think it's really, really important to think about that strategic position that you have under the legislation. And then, of course, the Additional Learning Needs Coordinator regulations of 2020, and these explicitly prescribe mandatory qualifications, experience, and functions of an ALN, and they legally bind the ALN to the coordination of additional learning provision, providing the statutory mechanism required to execute school-wide auditing and reporting functions. Now, there's a lot about auditing and reporting functions when you read the ALN reports, etc., and other independent research. You will read, and I'm sure you have been reading already, about so much of the role of the ALN is kind of tied up in that auditing and reporting. But again, that's really, really important, don't get me wrong. But we also need to think about how we can spend time building relationships with people, whether that's fellow teaching staff or our SLT or external support or parents or even the pupils themselves, because that's a key skill and aspect of the ALN role, is to build those relationships. We already mentioned this morning that importance of the relational role in teaching generally and in the ALN role in particular. And then, of course, there's the Additional Learning Needs Code for Wales, and in that Chapter 8, dedicated entirely to the duties of the ALN. So if you haven't visited that, it's well worth doing. Talks about how you translate principles and supporting classroom practice. So ALNs are tasked with advising and supporting classroom teachers, promoting inclusive whole school pedagogical approaches, and ensuring that staff understand the core principles of the ALN system. So that's that really important relational role of interactions between people. And then auditing and reporting as well. ALNs should monitor the effectiveness of provisions, audit the school's compliance with statutory individual development plans, and report directly to the head teacher and governing body. to inform strategic resource allocation. Again, really important that as Elenkos or those in other leadership positions, we effectively monitor the impact of the things that we're doing. Don't just carry on with them without being confident that what we're doing is actually worthwhile in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of the best value for money, in terms of resources, etc., etc. So that is very much a policy background, but really important for us to be thinking about. Okay, and we've touched on this already, but crucially, they must work with others to effect change. Essentially, change comes about through social processes of engaging and interacting with a range of people. And the work, the research by Murphy et al. 2025, which is on the reference slide at the end of this set, is definitely worth looking at if you haven't looked at it already. So that was a qualitative study that highlighted the dual nature of the modern or the current Elenko. It captures how Elenkos act as critical mediators who translate abstract statutory principles and duties, those which we've just been discussing, into classroom teaching, while simultaneously navigating a high-pressure workload dominated by administrative, auditing, and compliance paperwork. So again, helps us to see the pressures there are on Elenkos in terms of those administrative roles, but also emphasizes the need for the Elenko to be effective at a personal level, the relationship building, good communication, etc., etc. Okay, so here's a little model which I'm sure you're probably very familiar with. There are various versions of this that have been knocking about for years, but Rouse's paper from 2008 is quite well known in the field of special education, additional learning needs. And it just talks about those three areas. So research indicates that change for inclusion involves movement in one of three areas. And those three areas are knowledge, belief, and practice. And Rouse posits that each of these is highly interactive and that change in one area can bring about change in the other two. I suppose with a little bit of a critical hat on there, I think it's important to remember that that's not necessarily true. And for example, an easy example of that might be under that area of knowing. It's all very well knowing about something. Policy, what is the policy? What should we be doing? It's all very well knowing about what does good pedagogical practice look like, etc., etc. But that doesn't necessarily translate into changing what we actually do. So I guess the assumption that being better, being more knowledgeable in one of these areas necessarily has a knock-on effect to all the others. We need to think carefully about that. And sometimes I think that that is something worth thinking about when we're considering professional development within our schools. So if we're putting aside time for staff to engage with some of these areas, how much is what we're doing just about knowing, and are we monitoring what the ongoing impact of increasing the size of that cog, if you like, or the speed with which it turns, what sort of impact is that actually having on believing, people's beliefs and attitudes, and of course, importantly, on doing what actually happens as a result of that. So I think in terms of that kind of CPD, particularly stuff that you might be thinking about, that you might be engaging with at the school level, that's definitely worth thinking about. Okay. Just to help us consider that in a kind of practical sense. So let's think about a couple of those attributes, the 5 attributes that you've been thinking about, and let's see how one or two of them how this might reflect in one or two of those. So I just had a quick think about that, and let's take a couple. So let's take the attribute of leadership, which is the 3rd attribute, generally as they're generally structured. So in terms of leadership, and this isn't exhaustive by any means, it's just an example. So in terms of that attribute of knowing, okay, so perhaps under leadership, that would be understanding how to audit classroom data to expose hidden performance gaps among vulnerable learners. The better we become at that, the more effective our practice might become. What about believing? Well, that conviction that inclusion is a collective, whole school responsibility, not just an isolated operational task for the Elenco. And you all say hallelujah, amen to that one. But how do you lead your staff to that understanding that it's not just you doing this, that they are all fundamentally engaged in that? That's part of those teacher attributes. And then practices or doing could be about modeling exemplary inclusive behaviors for early career teachers in particular, auditing the physical and sensory accessibility of the classroom environment, and many other things that you could add in there. So let's take one final attribute, professional learning. So knowing how to read, critique, and actively apply empirical educational research to immediate classroom challenges. And you might not realize it, but I think your engagement with this master's will be very much strengthening that attribute in you. It might be something that kind of creeps up on you without you quite being aware, that you will become a little bit more tentative about just jumping onto the latest bandwagons or buying in the latest consultancy on a particular way of doing things. But you'll be able to step back and have a good think about, well, what's the research that's behind this? What does it tell us about how impactful it is, whether it's economically useful, whether it's good value for what we're spending on it in terms of time and money, etc., etc. So that knowing how to read, critique, and actively apply empirical research, and then believing that notion of intellectual humility, acknowledging personal knowledge gaps regarding various areas of additional support needs and evolving educational needs. And that's a really interesting one. So are individual teachers willing to admit that there are gaps in their knowledge in what they need to know about? And for us too, are we humble intellectually? Do we have that intellectual humility and that curiosity to be able to explore in greater depth these areas where we need to develop? And of course, all that links into practices. Our teachers, are we engaging in action research to systematically evaluate the impact of classroom adjustments, using reflective practice to expose and eliminate perhaps implicit bias, or deal with particular gaps in learners' knowledge and skills, etc., etc. And you can tick that box because you'll be doing the assignment for this particular module, which is very much based around some of those ideas. So you can see how you can look at each of these particular 5 attributes and split them down into those 3 particular areas. And that might be a particular way of helping you do your audit of your own practices and your own setting. So that might be something for you to think about in terms of that. Okay. I think, again, this could be very useful for your audit as well. This inclusive pedagogical approach in action. And this was developed by Florian back in 2014. There have been some kind of updates and revisions and developments in it since, but this is the basic one. So I'm not going to read through that in absolute detail, but looking at this right-hand column here, what to look for in practice. So with regard to difference, environments for learning provide opportunities for everyone. All learners able to participate in classroom learning. There's an extension of what is ordinarily available. Additional or different learning experiences are used minimally. Differentiation achieved through choice of the learner. So just some examples there. The belief of practitioners. The focus is on what is taught, not who. Opportunities are provided for learners to choose the level at which they engage. Consultation with learners is routinely carried out, so that relationship again between the teacher and the learner. There are reflective responses to support difficulties for learners. So is that constant reflection on what's going on? Is that happening in classrooms? Is it happening across the school? And then some final examples from that lower item there. The practitioners continually develop creative ways of working with others. So what might that look like? Is there an interplay between personal and professional stance, as well as the stance and team and wider organization? Are spaces for inclusion created where possible by seeking and trying out new ways of working? So it's all about those kind of more creative ways of engaging with these issues. And again, we'll have a little go here about thinking about those things. So I'm going to divide you into your groups, and I'm going to give you 20 minutes to have this discussion. So we'll come back just before, where are we? Just before 1:15. And these are the 3 things for you to think about. Just take some notes. I won't ask you to feed into a pebble pad or anything like that, but just note down some key points. So describe what beliefs about differences in learning and inclusion exist in your setting. It's always interesting to compare notes from different settings. How do these relate to descriptors in the IPAA, if at all? And I'll flip back to that slide now. And then, what creative ways have you implemented or seen implemented in your own experience of working with others to support better inclusive practice? So we're not necessarily now just talking about your current setting. Maybe you were elsewhere and you experienced some creative ways of working with others, excuse me, to support better inclusive practice. Or maybe you weren't involved in it, but you saw someone else doing it. So I'd be really interested to hear about these creative ways, these positive ways, and it'd be useful to share some of them. So hopefully you will have access to that particular slide. So have a look at these in particular for that last question for discussion. Have a look at those and see what you can feed back. Okay, great. So Anne, can you do your magic